Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting us to speak today. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the session. I'll be discussing today with regards to hemlock woolly Adelgid. I'll be discussing a bit about the biology and the history, what to look for. I'll talk about the latest observations, and I'll talk a bit about how you can help. Big problem, tiny pest, for sure. HWA, or the hemlock woolly Adelgid, it's a major threat to hemlock trees in eastern Canada. And I believe that addressing this pest really requires a collaborative approach. And we really are working on combining the efforts of a variety of different groups, including community scientists, volunteers, research scientists, First Nations, forest managers, and many NGOs and others. And through this collaboration, I hope we can develop effective solutions to tackle this its ecological problem. HWA is it's an invasive species. It has a very high reproductive rate. It can rapidly multiply and spread throughout hemlock forests. It's native to Japan. And in its native environment, it's not a native. It's not a pest. As predators and some host resistance keeps the populations very low, and they do not impact trees in a very negative way. However, in eastern North America, where it's been introduced, we don't have these natural predators that are present. So in the image on the screen, there's a microscopic view of an HWA. So it's been blown up about 100 times. So you can see it's not the most attractive critter out there. I'll just turn on my little pointer here. But I did want to point out a couple things. And one thing I wanted to point out on this picture is the this kind of stylet area. So it's like a, just hang on here. There we go. So it's got like a large, this is its mouth part, and this is what it used to insert into the twig of an infested tree, and this is where it feeds. So it's really long mouth part. So I just wanted to focus on that while I have that picture up. Now, there are 9 species of hemlocks around the world, and there's 5 in Asia, and there's 4 in North America. And I mentioned that it's native to Japan. It's also native in other Asian countries as well. So it's found in India and in Taiwan and in China, and it's also found on the west coast of North America. And in Canada, of course, we have 3 species of hemlock. We've got 2 species out west. We've got we've got western hemlock and mountain hemlock. And then in the east, we have our eastern hemlock, of course. And HWA has now invaded into all these populations, but it's really only a pest in eastern North America. And it's really thought to be a combination of natural enemies that keep the populations low and some host resistance that's present in the other species of hemlock. So this map shows the current distribution of HWA in eastern North America. And you can also see on this map the area that's highlighted in kind of green. That's an approximate estimation of the range of eastern hemlock in eastern North America. And then the areas that are brown or in yellow are areas where HWA has been introduced. And it was first confirmed on the East Coast in Virginia, and that was in the 1950s when they confirmed it. So it had been there for some time before that. And in Canada, we had our first introductions in Canada go back about 10 years or so in Ontario, when we had interceptions of HWA in the Toronto area and also in the Niagara Glen. And then in both those cases, the number of affected trees were low, and there were some efforts made to remove the affected trees. But then around 2019, we started seeing larger populations that were established in Southeast Ontario, and since that time, we've been finding more populations. In Nova Scotia, our first detections were made in 2017, and since that time, we've seen it spread into Nova Scotia into seven counties where it's well established in the southwest part of the province, and we have a couple of new sites in Halifax County and or Halifax HRM, and also into Hants County. So the impact that HWA has on hemlocks is quite significant. HWA can cause defoliation, twig dieback, and mortality quite quickly in as few as 4 years. But sometimes trees that are infested will linger for a longer period of time. Of course, hemlock is a very important species ecologically. It's a foundation species in the forest, and its loss affects other species as well. So this is what I'm trying to characterize as the impact of losing some of these trees on the landscape. All sizes and ages of trees can be attacked. All they really need is foliage, and it's really the feeding that the feeding at the base of the needles will eventually cause the buds to die at the end of the twigs. And so why that's kind of significant, or why that's something to share, is that we see trees that are heavily infested, but they look fairly healthy at first. They look quite green. They look fairly healthy, but then once that bud dies and then the needles start falling off, then it just doesn't have a lot of regrowth, and the trees really decline after that. And drought and other factors can significantly hasten the impacts of HWA as well, and can cause trees to die more quickly. So I have a few pictures from Nova Scotia that show some of the impacts. And so this is a picture from 2022 along the Sisebou River, and I'll just draw your attention to the gray ghost kind of casts of the trees along the riverbanks, and those are hemlocks that are either dead or close to dead from HWA. There's also a pocket up in the north, and a couple of other sites nearby. This one is from a community called Bear River. There's a gorge there that has a significant amount of hemlock that's it's now dead or close to dead. And then these trees are also in the same. And for a final impact slide, I'll show you a picture. This site is in Yarmouth County. It's in a place called Springhaven. And this site was one of our probably the most severe impact we've seen to date at this site, where there's a large number of trees that are dead. And when you walk in the underneath those trees now, basically you see standing dead trees, but you see no hemlock regeneration at all in the understory. So a little bit more about HWA itself. It reproduces asexually. They're all female. So you only need one individual to start a new population. They have 2 generations per year. The number of eggs can range depending on different factors, but if we estimate about 50 to 100 eggs each time, we can end up with 2,500 to 10,000 progeny just for one female per year. So just after a couple of years, you can have millions of these established in an area. So even if you get high mortality, even if you think you're getting high mortality from other factors, this capacity to really explode in population can really is one of the factors that really makes it successful in hemlock. Of course, I've already mentioned that we don't have natural native predators in eastern North America, and most eastern hemlock have little host resistance to HWA. Sometimes the life cycle can get a little complicated, but I'll just share a couple things about it. This schematic shows the 2 generations. So there's one generation, which is, I'll call it the winter generation, that takes 9 months to develop. And then we've got a faster spring generation that takes 3 months to develop. And this winter one takes longer because one of the reasons it takes longer is because they they go to sleep for several months after they establish on a tree. And so this is sort of the two different life cycles depending on the months of the year. And the other thing I'll point out about this schematic is that there's a stage that does travel to spruce trees in its native environment. And so we do have some Adelgid that will have wings and they'll try and go off and find a spruce tree. But in North America, this has been a dead end. They haven't successfully colonized our native spruce trees. So it's not something that we see happening in North America, but it is something that happens in its native range. So all of the damage and all of the reproduction we see is asexual that happens right on hemlock trees. So just a little bit more about the different life stages. So if I look at the eggs, these little egg sacs, there's little eggs laid in there. When the eggs hatch, they come out as crawlers, and this is a really tiny. They look really like small bits of ground up pepper. They're really, really tiny. You can sort of see a couple there in relation to a penny from U.S. penny. These are highly mobile and they're abundant and they can land on all kinds of different things. In Nova Scotia, they're present from April until September. And it's the crawlers and the eggs that can really be spread easily into new areas. The other life stages really need to have, a live plant to be moved from one area to another for it to spread. So the crawlers, once they hatch, they go out and they crawl. They have legs. They move out to the new growth of the hemlock trees, looking for a good place to feed. And then what they'll do is they'll set up at the base of a needle. They'll insert their mouth parts and they'll start feeding. And they won't move again for the rest of their lives. They'll stay there and not be able to move. So once they've set up shop at the base of a needle, they're there for good. And then what they'll do is they'll feed. They may go to sleep for a few months. They may estivate, or they may feed continuously, depending on which generation they're in. And then they'll start secreting waxy material out of the pores of their back and covering their bodies. And the material is kind of wool-like. And this is really the most recognizable feature of HWA is this wool. So how does it spread? Well, it spreads through these crawlers. Is one way it spreads, and it can spread, naturally, I guess, or on its own with just the wind. Sometimes these crawlers can land on, birds or maybe some mammals and spread that way. So that's kind of like what I would call kind of local spread or relatively short distance spread. And then long distance spread can happen by people. People can move things like infected nursery stock or logs or firewood that have these life stages on them, and they can help spread it long distances. So when you're out looking at hemlock trees, what would you look for? Well, the easiest thing to look for is the white woolly egg sacs that are at the base of the needles. And what we like to do when we're looking at hemlock trees is we like to turn the branch over and look on the underside because they're they're easier to find on the underside of the branches. And we also look at the latest growth. So either this past year's growth or maybe 2 years of growth. So we're looking at the last 30 centimeters or so of the branches, and we're looking for these white woolly egg sacs. And also we tend to look down a lot. So we look at branches, but we also look on the ground because then when you're in a hemlock forest walking around, you see a lot of twigs and branches that have fallen from the crowns, and we pick those up and look for signs of egg sacs. Now, another thing you can look for are nymphs. Nymphs are these little newly hatched crawlers that have come out and established at the base of the needles. They're really tiny, so sometimes you might need a hand lens to see those, but they kind of look like a little tiny little poppy seed or little sesame seed that has like a little white halo around them, something very tiny. Sometimes when we're looking for HWA, we'll find other things as well that kind of look like it. And these are some examples of that. Things like a spider or ovisac. Sometimes just bird poop will land on branches and it kind of looks a bit like HWA. You have to look closely at that. Other adelgids will have white fluff that might land on a hemlock. Sometimes sap or scale insects. So, if you're ever you ever happen to come across something that looks suspicious, I would encourage you just to take a picture and send it to one of us, or send it to somebody you know that knows HWA, so they can take a look and give you some feedback. So with these crawlers and this way of spread in mind, there's a few steps that we take when we're that we recommend people take when they're in areas where areas when visiting areas that are high risk or could be infested, and particularly during the period from April to September when the crawlers are active. And things like avoiding placing gear on or near hemlock trees, wiping down equipment with ethanol-based cleaner. We use lint rollers on our clothing to lint roll any crawlers or anything that might be on our clothing. It's actually handy for taking ticks off as well, which is nice. It's a bonus. Wearing light-colored clothing helps, and the most important thing on this list really is laundering all clothing prior to re-entering the field. So when I'm in the field and I'm in an infested stand, I don't wear that same gear when I head out when I do a follow-up at a different site, say later in the week or something. So the CFIA we're doing a few different activities with respect to HWA, and one is that we're regulating it as a pest. And so we have a quarantine zone, a regulated area set up that includes some parts of Southwest Nova Scotia, some places in Southeast Ontario, and then the province of British Columbia. And if you're within one of those zones, there are restrictions on moving hemlock material out. So the restrictions affect things like plants. So if you have nursery stock that are hemlock, we don't want those leaving those areas because they could be spreading HWA. But then also things like decorative foliage and branches, forest products with bark, mulch, dried branches, and firewood of all species all fall under our regulations. And so when people would like to move material out, it's regulated. So there are some things that people can do to reduce the risk. So they should contact their CFIA office, and we can either do an inspection or go over the details on what people would have to do to allow stuff to be moved outside the regulated areas. Another thing that we're working on to try and do with respect to HWA is to enhance our outreach capacity. So we have products that we've developed. So we have some signs, metal signs that people can put in the forests and parks. We have ones designed for places that are infested and ones that are designed for places not infested yet or where it hasn't been found. We make these available. So if there's people that are interested, they can contact us and we can help them out with that. We have cards, social media posts, and we've been working with collaborators, different organizations like the CCIS and others to develop collaborative products. And we're always encouraging citizen science and community science reporting through whether it's through EdMaps or iNaturalist or whatever you find helpful, whatever you like to use. So I'm just going to finish off my portion of the talk with sharing some of our latest observations that we've had over the last year or so. And I'll start in Ontario. And so in March of 2023, we had a new population found in the Hamilton area. And then later that year in August, we had a population found in, or I should say that was reported by the Royal Botanical Garden. In August, we had a trap. So there's a monitoring network in place for HWA, and that monitoring network resulted in some crawlers being detected in the trap, and then our CFI staff went out and found trees infested in the area as well. So that population was found through that method. And then we also had some colleagues with the province of Ontario report another find in October in the Niagara region. And then just most recently in Ontario, in the Pelham area, we had a report from the public about some new detections just north of where we have a regulated area. Now, if I move to the Nova Scotia situation, we had 2 detections within the last year that were outside of our regulated area. One was in Hants County in the St. Croix area, and that was reported to us by an NGO, by a collaborator. And then in around the same time, actually just a little bit later, the same month in August, we had a homeowner in Bedford HRM report to us about finding it on their property in their backyard, and so we followed up there. And so we've been in the process of doing follow-up around those sites, and so far the populations we haven't been able to find additional populations yet in those areas, so it seems like it's a relatively early introductions in those sites. So finally, I just wanted to put a plug in for one of the ways that people can help, and it's by reporting your observations through your mobile device. So if you, this is just, if you can report on iNaturalist, you can report on EdMaps, those are all good ways to report. But if you'd like to try out an app to record your observations, you can do that as well. And basically what you do is you just go onto the iTunes Store or the Google Play, and you download Survey 123. It's a free app, and you don't need an account. There's a little button at the bottom here. You just click on log in without, or enter the software without logging in. You don't need to log in. And then you can scan this QR code and it'll download a form. And it's something that a lot of our collaborators have been using, and it's really helpful. And we don't just want to get positive or reports like that. We like to get negative reports. They're really helpful for us so that we can help make decisions on where best to use our resources. And so that ends my portion of the talk, and I'm going to pass it over to Chris to provide us with a great, just share some of the great work that the Canadian Forest Service Natural Resources Canada is doing with respect to HWA.
Thanks, Ron. Can folks see my screen? Ron, you'll have to give me a thumbs up or not. Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. I saw a couple familiar names on the list of attendees, so hi everybody. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we do, mostly here in Ontario. I'll touch a little bit on some of the work that's going on in Nova Scotia, and certainly if there's questions about those projects, I think between myself and Ron, we can probably answer questions. So I always like to start with sort of acknowledgement of the folks that do the work in the lab. This is our team for a couple of years ago from 2 summers ago, and that does a bunch of the work. Megan, the woman in the green pants and the shades, and Victoria with the ball cap. Those are the two researchers in the lab that lead a lot of our work. But without all these folks, we couldn't do what we do. And then all the folks on the bottom of the screen there, collaborators in the Forest Service and the provinces, and with the CFIA, Ron's name's on there too. And then in the provinces and with our other funding bodies. So just talk a little bit about some of the research that we do. So the reason and the way we kind of think about these things is in terms of like a pest management response. And so what this graph shows is kind of the classic invasive species curve, right? So that's a black line. It just shows the area infested. Excuse me, the boxes show the boxes there show the area infested over time. And the black line shows your costs, right? So in terms of when you're managing invasive species, you got to do prevention. Then if it gets introduced, you have to do eradication. Then you're into containment, and finally you're into kind of resource protection and management. Let's get my pointer out here. I think that's my pointer. Yeah. And the components of a pest risk response, you're doing different things at different times along this kind of invasion continuum. You're doing prevention, you're doing detection ID, you're doing control at different times. You're assessing risk early on. Later on, you're doing restoration and rehabilitation, but you're always kind of doing research. And so that's kind of where we are. Like if we talk about where Nova Scotia and Ontario is, Nova Scotia might sort of be in this area here. I hope you can see my pointer sign in between sort of containment, research, protection, and management. Ontario is a little further back because we don't have quite as much HWA, so we're kind of in this eradication, probably early in the containment phase of HWA. So that's kind of where we are. And so when we think about the goals of our research response, we kind of put it into three buckets. We have sort of our short term where we're trying to develop tools and tactics to like find the bug, manage it, and mitigate those new detections. So manage it when it's small. In the medium term, we want tools to help us find the stands that are going to be at risk, and then do something about arrival and infestation. And then the longer term, we're trying to help manage it as an established pest. So we have native pests like spruce budworm, mountain pine beetle that we manage, but we also have things like emerald ash borer that have been here a long time. We manage those more like we do, classic things that have been here a long time. So it's trying to get this toolbox of things ready to manage HWA in Canada for a while. So the hemlock woolly adelgid has been on our radar for a long time. We were fortunate enough to recruit Jeff Fidgen about like 12, 14 years ago now, and Jeff spent a lot of his time in the States working on with Scott Salem's lab. And so even before HW was here, he and Jean Turgeon worked with Mark Whitmore in the States in upstate New York, looking at development of sampling tools and tactics, right? So different ways to sample for it. And folks might be familiar with the ball sampling technique and some of the sticky trap sampling techniques that they came up with. And then later on, we developed a hemlock woolly adelgid management plan for Canada. So what do we do if it shows up? And this has sort of been used since then. We have a sort of biological control framework that we worked on for the Maritimes, and then we've got some technical advisory committees working groups in Ontario, and then the one that Ron mentioned earlier on that in Nova Scotia. And these guide kind of the research questions that we have and the directions that we go into trying to figure out what we want to do and what tools we want to build for land managers. In terms of our research response, we kind of put the projects that we do into these like buckets of like risk assessment, mitigation, and resilience, and these just kind of tie short versus long-term goals. So in terms of the things we've been doing, the things that we've sort of completed since 2019, so kind of since the detection of HWA, a lot of that improving those detection and trapping tools. So that was just building on that work that Jeff has done, optimizing different strategies for allocation of resources. So what's the best mix of different partners doing different kinds of survey. We've looked at overwintering survival of hemlock woolly adelgid, and I'll talk about that a bit later. We looked at some species distribution modeling of HWA, about where it might go, and I'll talk about that too. And then not a lot in kind of our risk mitigation bucket, but in terms of resilience, in Ontario, we looked at some of the silvicultural tactics that have been developed in the States, and looked at that through the lens of Ontario's silvicultural management guide for hemlock, and tried to adapt some of those and give some advice to landowners about what they could do in advance of HWA, and then should HWA arrive in their stands or nearby. And that's a paper in the Forestry Chronicle by Bill Parker that came out about 2 months ago. So folks can check that out if they're interested. In terms of stuff that's ongoing, there's a tremendous amount of research that's happening both in Ontario and in Nova Scotia. In terms of Ontario, we're looking at a revised hemlock inventory for Southern Ontario. This is some work we've been doing with Guelph and a graduate student in Ben DeVries' lab using some remote sensing tools. The inventory we have for hemlock in Southern Ontario kind of dates back to the 70s, so it's quite out of date. We like to update that because that will help in terms of survey and risk. We have a student at the University of Toronto who's kind of updating those species distribution models and stand risk assessments for Ontario, kind of putting these two products together to kind of give us a real idea where we should be concerned about in this province. And they're looking at phenology in Ontario, and I'll talk about that in a bit. In terms of risk mitigation, there's still work on optimizing survey and detection, different kinds of traps, different kinds of, what's the best time and place to put these out and how to use them. There's been a fair amount of work on insecticides, mostly by John Sweeney in the Maritimes, which has led to the registration of some of the products here in Canada. Chris Edge and some other folks are looking at the fate and efficacy and non-target impact of those insecticides. I'm looking kind of their long-term use on the landscape. So that's work that's ongoing. There's the HWA biological control program in Nova Scotia. There's a surveillance and monitoring network for HWA, and that's kind of the end of this talk. then optimizing different eDNA detection methods. And then in Ontario, we have a development of a management guide for Ontario hemlock that should come out here pretty soon, we hope. So I'm going to talk about 4 projects that we've got going in Ontario, and just sort of briefly touch on each one of them and sort of what we're kind of doing. And this is stuff that I just sort of talked about. So the first project we've been looking at is doing the phenology of HWA, and this is just figuring out what stages of the insect. So Ron showed us that life cycle a couple slides ago, just talking about, what stage of the insect is present on the landscape. And this is kind of basic, invasive pest 101, because with that information, we can figure out, when's the best time to apply insecticides, when's the best time to, if we want to release biological control agents, so we want to know what the effective climate has been on how the insect grows. So it's developing that kind of data. So what we've been doing in Ontario starting last year was surveying. It's basically going into 2 infested stands in Ontario, one on the north shore of Lake Ontario and the other one in the Niagara region, and collecting infested branches of hemlock wood with hemlock woolly Adelgid. So early in the spring, in that fast generation that Ron was talking about, we collected twice per week. And then when it slowed down in that slower generation, we were doing once every 2 weeks. And these, initially we started collecting the samples and we would drive down, pick them up and drive back twice a week. A bit later on, the MNR was kind enough to do that sampling for us, and they would ship it up to our containment lab in Sault Ste. Marie. So we've got a insect containment facility in Sault Ste. Marie where we don't have hemlock woolly Adelgid, but we can safely work on this stuff in containment and it won't escape. So this came into our lab. We counted all the insects that were on samples of these branches, and then we determined the stage that all these insects were in. So a lot of microscope work. And then what you can do with that kind of data is you can just fit a model, right? Just a mathematical model. That's the highlighted bit there if you want to look at the math. And this one comes from some work done in the States by Patrick Tobin and Richard Turcott. And what you can do is you just express those counts in terms of the cumulative proportion of the insects that you found. So like how much of that particular stage of the insect have you found over time? And we express time as degree days. So just like, how many growing units, temperature units have accumulated over time for these different stages. So Progredien's egg and Progredien's egg hatch, that's that early season. And then our cystens, newly hatched cystens, settled first instar cystens, that's that slower generation that Ron talked about. So we did this for our 2 populations in Southern Ontario. And so that's what I'm going to show here. And so what we see, at least in Southern Ontario last year, is that we get, so this is just cumulative proportion of what we found over accumulated degree days, and then our different stages in different colors. And what and then I've just converted degree days back to calendar days. And so we got egg lay happening about, April 21st to May 6th. We have egg hatch around May 18th to 30th. We've got our cystens estimation starting, mid-July. We missed the crawler stage in 2023 because of a series of unfortunate events, and basically we had a strike in the public service, and we were out of the building for a while. And when we were collecting samples, and by the time we got back to them and processed them, realized we were getting the wrong kind of foliage. And so by the time we got it corrected, we sort of missed that cystens instar, the cystens stage. So we hope to get that this year. And everything was kind of looking great, except we're noticing that because our winter was so warm, our populations are starting, and we're already seeing eggs in Southern Ontario. So hopefully we can get this figured out for this year and have a good idea of the phenology, at least in Ontario. I was kind of interested in knowing, roughly when do we expect these events to occur? So what I can do is take those degree day timings that we figured out and try and then look at past climate data and try and figure out, when might we expect these times to come, these events to occur based on calendar day at our different sample sites, and a couple places maybe where the Adelgid isn't. So, and this is just looking at the past 5 years of climate data for different sites in Ontario. So I looked at kind of the earliest day, the mean day, and the latest day for 3 sites. So Grafton, which is one of our sample sites, Short Hills, which is in the Niagara, which is our other sample site, that's our warm site. And then in the Sioux, and which is on the sort of on the northern part of Hemlock's range. We don't have it here, but it's close. And so since I live here, I'm curious. And what we see is that sort of overall, if you look at all these days, the first thing I'd get you to notice is that it can definitely develop in Sault Ste. Marie, so that at the northern edge of its range. It certainly shifted a lot later than it is down south, but it could develop here if it got introduced. The second thing that's interested to us is you get about a 2-week variance in development timing between our sites in the Niagara, which is typically warmer, versus that cooler north shore of Lake Ontario. So even at over what is a very short distance, you get this big difference in phenology, and so that affects how you're going to perhaps do management activities. So the second thing we wanted to look at, we were looking at recently, is overwintering survival. So folks may have remembered last winter was actually a real winter, and it was like cold. And so we had one of these really big cold events that was predicted around the 4th of February. And so we were fortunate enough to kind of get a fellow who was able to sort of look at some models and predict this for us, and collaborated with Jeff Vidgen and the folks in Nova Scotia and some folks in CFIA. And we were able to get samples like right before this cold event happened and right after it happened. And we were curious to see what's the instantaneous effect of that big cold event on killing HWA in Canada, because some of the models and some of the data show that we might be kind of at the northern edge limit of the climate especially for cold and how much cold it can handle. So what we did there is we sampled right before, and that's what these, so what you're seeing here, this is the temperature trace at our 4 sites. So our 2 sites in Nova Scotia and our 2 sites in Ontario, over from the beginning of January until mid-March. And then the white circles are when we sampled before, and then the gray circles are when we sampled right after. And then the temperatures is the low point they reached on the 4th of February, 2023. And what you see is that was by far the coldest night in all of those places in last year. And in some of these places, that was the coldest that they'd ever seen for for in the past 15 years or 20 years or even ever. And so then over here, what we have is the mortality, the estimated number of live Hemlock woolly adelgid per shoot right before the cold event and then right after the cold event. And what we see is we had about, and then the lines connect the same trees. So we sampled the same trees before and after to control for that. And what we see is we get about, 50 or 60, we get about 20 to 30% survival following those mortality events. So we get rather significant mortality, but not enough to wipe out the populations in Nova Scotia at those sites, and we didn't see actually any difference in our population at Wainfleet because it didn't get cold enough. We sampled the Grafton as well. We weren't able to get there before. We got there after. We saw 100% mortality at that site. But when we sampled at that site later on in the summer, we saw that population building back. And what that speaks to is what Ron talked about, where, because the insect's parthenogenic, because it reproduces asexually, you don't need, that it can build back very quickly. And so you don't need very many survivors to be able to have those populations grow back in those stands. And so what this says is, even with these really, really cold events, you can get big mortality, but it's not enough to wipe out the populations. Certain enough to maybe slow them down a little bit for a year or two, but it's not going to eliminate the problem. And certainly with a winter like we just had, survival is probably really good. And so that tells us sort of what the effect of winter will be on these populations. So that gets us thinking a bit about what the range expansion is going to be like. And we're in Ontario, we're interested, how far can Hemlock woolly adelgid expand into Ontario? So this is the range of hemlock that Ron showed earlier, and these are our sites where we know that we have it. Some of the existing models say that it should sort of be limited on the North Shore, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie. And so I've been interested in this question for a while, and it's sort of wanting to build one of these species distribution models. And at the same time, an undergraduate student at Lakehead University named Cameron Cornelson, he was interested in the same question for his undergraduate thesis. And so his prof happened to be a friend of mine. And so we got together and Cameron did this project, basically building a species distribution model for Hemlock woolly adelgid for Eastern Canada using iNaturalist data. So that's what this is. So all the red dots are Hemlock woolly adelgid observations from iNaturalist, which is mostly public observations of the insect, and there's also some museum data in there. And then the gray basically just shows the probability of Hemlock woolly adelgid surviving in different places in Eastern Canada. So you can see Nova Scotia, it's kind of all black, that suggests the adelgid could live in just about all those places. That range extends into most of Michigan, this part of Southern Ontario, and stretching up into the Bruce Peninsula here, and then even along the North Shore of Lake Ontario. And so this is basically what the predicted distribution of Hemlock woolly adelgid could be based on where it lives now and present climate. So what Cameron did next is he pushed this through a series of emission scenarios. And this is just basically, what sociological things might impact carbon emissions, climate change over the world under different scenarios. Like, do we change how we, do we all drive electric cars or this kind of thing? And so what these are different emission scenarios we have here. And the ones I'd have you focus on are these two sort of near future. So 2041, 2061, they're low emissions, and 2041, 2016, they're mid emissions. So kind of the most reasonable scenarios. And what this shows is that Adelgid could, infest most of Southern Ontario, into New Brunswick and all of Nova Scotia, and the same thing under a mid emission scenario. And you can sort of see the range of Hemlock woolly Adelgid here. Now these are models, they're predictions of what might happen. Models can do funny things. If you look at some of the really far future scenarios, it pushes the range of Hemlock woolly Adelgid, past the existing range of hemlock and up into, far northern Ontario, which is perhaps probably unrealistic. So these are hypotheses. These are models to be tested, but it gives us an idea of what the risk might be. We can estimate the risk of the Adelgid to these places, and it suggests that a lot of Ontario and a lot of the Maritimes would be infested by HWA. So the final thing is our eDNA detection network, and Ron touched on this a bit with the Haldeman detection. So this kind of all started with a tweet. There's a researcher named Charlene Partridge. She works at Grand Valley State, Michigan. Michigan's also been dealing with Hemlock woolly Adelgid, and Charlene came up with this interception trap for HWA. It's made with a 3D printer, and what you do is you mount microscope slides here in these slots. And the slides have been dipped with eDNA with Vaseline. And the idea is you put this out under a hemlock tree or near hemlock trees where you think you might have Adelgid, and either the crawler stage falls on these and lands and gets stuck in the Vaseline, or the fluff or the evidence of the Adelgid gets caught in the Vaseline, and you can take this back to the lab, scrape off the Vaseline, run it through the magic DNA machine, and it'll tell you whether hopefully tell you if the Adelgid is there. And so Charlene's been working on this for a couple of years, and we thought this was really cool. And we tried it in Ontario in a small little project in 2020 or 2021 down in Niagara. It worked really good for us, and we thought this would make a neat kind of community science thing. So we partnered with some folks in the ISC and the CFIA to basically make kits out of these traps and send them out to folks. And this is just an example of what it looks like underneath the microscope with Darissa here from the ISC. And this is all based on the Budworm Tracker program, which folks may have heard of. This is a citizen science program that's been run out of the Atlantic Forestry Centre for a number of years, where we give spruce budworm traps to folks to track the populations of that insect. And we thought it's been a really cool program. We've got lots of neat data out of it. This is Ontario from last year, if folks are interested. So building on that idea, we built out the same kind of network in Southern Ontario. And so all these red dots, so the dots are people that volunteered. We had a website where they could sign up. And the red dots are the folks that were able to give a kit. We only had 50 last year, and this is what a kit looks like. So they got the trap and the slides and some gloves and a bunch of instructions. You had to supply your own stick, so you could put the trap up on a stick. All these folks did this, and we had our one new detection at Haldeman that came in from when the traps were returned to us in the late summer. And so building on this, we sort of have what we call the fellowship of the trap. And so this is kind of a project that we have different partners. So the Invasive Species Centre here in Ontario, it does the program coordination, the product development. They lead a lot of the knowledge transfer activities to kind of get traps out to folks, deal with the website, that kind of stuff. The CFIA does all of our site inspections, should we get a positive find through the program. It also does all the eDNA analysis out of Aaron Campbell's lab. So, after we scraped off all the Vaseline and put it in vials, we send it off to Aaron, and she does the DNA detection using some of the primers and whatnot that Charlene's developed. And then here at NRCan, we kind of do the science side of it. So we work on developing the protocols, optimizing where the trap should go, this kind of thing. And then we do some of the processing out of our lab here in the Sioux. So that's, that the three kind of working together, it's proved really kind of a really neat project. We thought it was just going to sort of grow slowly. We were going to do 50 last year, maybe 100 this year. It's kind of blown up on us a little bit, I think, because of the find at Haldeman. So now I believe we're going to have traps in Nova Scotia. I think Ron's going to have some this summer. I think maybe in PEI and in Quebec and possibly in New Brunswick. I'm not sure. So we've got it's kind of this thing that has blown up on us, and it's all kind of goes back to just Charlene sharing this neat design that she had on social media. So that's kind of all I had to talk about research. There's the bug again. This is usually how I end it. So we got our little tiny bugs here, little tiny Adelgids at the base of these needles. This is kind of one Adelgid right here, so give you an idea of how small they are, but they can cause this huge problem and all that mortality that Ron shared.